get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for this COMPAS webinar. We apologize for the technical glitches that had us going live a little earlier than we had planned, but we're excited to have a very stimulating discussion. The topic of the webinar is markets in the workplace. I'm Eric McGilvray. I'm a professor in the political science department here at Ohio State, and I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS program on markets in the open society. As many of you know, COMPAS is a program of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS is an acronym that stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the mission of the COMPAS program is to promote civil and informed discussion of important and controversial public issues. Obviously, the question of whether markets promote or hinder the aims of an open society is one of the most contentious issues, public issues of our time. And this webinar will explore that question as it bears specifically on the nature of work and the place of the working class in the 21st century economy. Before we get to that discussion, I'd like to briefly tease the next COMPAS Colloquium, which will be held on October 8th, 3 weeks from today, on the topic of markets and the family. That event will feature Ann Cudd, Provost and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and Maxine Eichner, Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina, with moderation by Lynn Chansolin from the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at Ohio State. It will be held in person in 165 Thompson Library at the same time as this webinar, 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. We hope you can join us for that event. More details about the markets and the family colloquium and about the whole COMPAS program are available at cehv.osu.edu/compass. Today's colloquium on markets in the workplace will be moderated by my colleague, Ben McKean. I'll let Ben introduce our panelists, but first let me briefly introduce him. Ben is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Ohio State. He's a political theorist who studies global justice, populism, and the relationship between theory and practice. And his recent book, Disorienting Neoliberalism, focuses, among other things, on how transnational supply chains shape the nature of work in the global economy. Ben, take it away.
Great, thanks, Eric. It is a real pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to moderating this conversation between Oren Cass and Oren Dubé. Let me introduce them briefly before turning it over to them. So Oren Cass is the Executive Director of American COMPAS, a think tank devoted to describing itself as restoring an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. He's the author of The Once and Future Worker, a vision for the renewal of work in America, as well as a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times. His work appears regularly in publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. From 2015 to 2019, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and prior to his time there, held roles as the domestic policy advisor for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012, as an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and as a management consultant at Bain & Company. Oren Dubé is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the IZA Institute of Labor Economics. His research focuses on labor economics, health economics, public finance, and political economy. His current areas of research include the effects of minimum wage on employment and inequality, work that I know he has been pursuing for decades, the role of fairness concerns at the workplace, the nature and extent of competition in the labor market, the interplay of behavioral biases in labor market competition, the impact of fiscal policy in local labor markets, and the role of firm wage policies in explaining the growth of inequality. So I think we have two outstanding panelists representing different viewpoints on this question about markets in the workplace. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Oren Cass for a presentation, and then we'll have Oren go next.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm still not quite used to sort of speaking out into the ether, but it's wonderful to be able to be with you, even if we're not actually quite with you. I guess I want to emphasize a few points just in making opening remarks. One is about why we care about work. I think it's important to actually establish that because it's actually been something that's missing from a lot of economic debates for a long time. A second point then is to think about what we ask of markets and how we think about markets and what we expect them to deliver. And then the third is thinking about trade-offs. And as you'll see, I think based on what I will say about work and markets, it suggests a lot of trade-offs that we might prefer not to grapple with, but that I think we have to, and that we can, fortunately, therefore, make policy choices that that do have the potential to make things better, particularly for segments of society that have not seen especially good economic outcomes in recent years. So point one, why work? It's important to keep in mind that in formal economic analysis, work is a bad thing. That the whole point of the game is to get as much stuff as you can while doing as little work as possible. And so as between the option of working all week in return for, say, $800 or not working at all and receiving $800, the economic model says you prefer to not work at all and receive the $800. And yet, I think we increasingly recognize there's something wrong with that, that work is in fact a very important positive value and activity that is important to people's lives. That's true in subjective ways. If you speak particularly to people in the working class, they will tend to emphasize the extent to which they want to see work be central in many ways to their lives. There's a wonderful op-ed by a colleague of mine in the New York Times a couple of days ago based on a series of focus groups he had done. His name is Patrick Brown. He's based at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, really looking at attitudes toward child benefits and benefits to help families. And he's someone who is inclined to support more of a sort of universal benefit that you get simply by virtue of being a parent. And the essay really goes through how struck he was by the extent to which the people he was speaking with did not share that view, and really wanted to see work as a cultural value placed front and center, even when designing programs specifically to help people like themselves. So there's work as a value, and then I think there's also work as a very tangible thing that affects people. You know, that when you work, you receive a paycheck, but there are also enormous effects on self-esteem and emotional well-being. You know, even if you look at self-reported happiness, if you look at whether marriages form in the first place, if you look at whether families stay together, work actually has an enormous positive value on many things like that. And for that matter, just being a child growing up in a household where someone is working, growing up in a neighborhood where people are working, tends to have a positive influence. And so when we think about how we want our economy to operate, then it's very important to recognize that we are not just asking it to generate lots of stuff for us to consume. We are also asking it to generate opportunities for us to produce. And that a well-functioning market economy, and one that is delivering on prosperity and providing for flourishing families and communities, is one that delivers on both sides of that equation. And that is, again, not something that the economic models are inherently going to focus on. And the models that say, for instance, that the freest market delivers the best outcomes are doing that only in terms of consumer welfare. It may be that you can get the most stuff for the lowest price that way, but that doesn't mean you will have actually gotten everything you need the economy to provide. So how do we get markets to provide what we want them to, which is not just innovation and plentiful stuff, but also opportunities for people of all backgrounds and all places with all aptitudes to work and to be able to support themselves and their families and be positive contributors to the society. It seems to me that the important thing to recognize about markets as a starting point is that a market is just a neutral processing mechanism. A market is a mechanism that takes a whole bunch of inputs about the conditions that are out there in the world and spits out an output. And what those conditions are and what constraints you put on how the market behaves are going to determine what output it produces. And so it's not the case that markets are good or markets are bad. There are a lot of things we really like about markets. There are things that markets do a lot better than other mechanisms will. But what outputs they generate are going to depend on the rules that we set for them. And I like to draw an analogy to sports, which I think can be really helpful in thinking about this, which is, if you think about professional sports as a mode of entertainment, it's actually quite peculiar. The way most forms of entertainment follow a script. We tell everyone what to do, and they dance across the stage or shoot each other in a pitched battle, and we expect that to be entertaining. Professional sports isn't like that. The whole point, in fact, and one reason we find it entertaining is that we don't know what is going to happen. You can have a scripted professional sport. You can have wrestling, and some people find that very entertaining. But what people like about basketball is that they don't know what's going to happen. And what a professional sports league does is it sets up a series of rules within which the players are going to compete. And the players actually aren't there to entertain us. In fact, a player who tries to do something entertaining instead of the thing that is most likely to generate a win for his team is likely to be criticized for showboating and not being in the spirit of the game and this and that. We expect them to focus just on competing and beating each other and trust that the result of that exercise will be something that is actually entertaining for everybody, that actually generates the benefit that is the point of putting this on in the first place. And that's how I think we should think about markets, that we arrange these markets and we ask people to go and compete within them, not because the competition for its own sake or somebody earning a lot of profit is necessarily good. It's because we think that setup and those people competing with each other are going to generate the spillovers, the outcomes for everybody that we actually do care about. And so we try to set up a set of rules that are going to generate that effect. But as in sports, those rules aren't always exactly right. And more importantly, they have to change over time. So if you take basketball as an example, they've had to change the rules. At one point, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was so dominant that they tried to ban dunking. And then a while later, they realized that was a really bad idea. And then they allowed dunking. And then they pushed the three-point line back. And they changed the rules for defense. And so over time, the players whose job is just to win as much as they can under the rules develop strategies that are not very entertaining, but allow them to win. And the rule makers have to respond to that by changing the rules to ensure that the way to win is to do something that is also entertaining. And I think that's exactly the position we are in right now in our markets. There have been periods of time where people pursuing profit in markets have behaved in ways that generated phenomenal outcomes for workers, for the nation as a whole. But in recent decades, people have come up with a lot of very good ways to win within the rules that don't generate what we're actually looking for. They've found ways to use workers from other parts of the world instead of American workers. They've found ways to use financial engineering instead of real investment that drives innovation. And so we have a situation where the rules of the market are going to need to change. And in particular, when we think about the rules, what we're really thinking about is what constraints do we want to impose? Because the constraints that we impose then determine the basis on which people compete with each other and where they direct their energies. And so if we think in those terms, then we end up realizing there are a lot of trade-offs in front of us, because every time we impose a constraint, it by definition cuts off something people want to be doing. But we may choose that because we think it will generate an outcome that we want in some other way. And so just as one example to leave you with here, how we address globalization, I think, is a vitally important question. If you think about globalization, it's essentially a way in which the rules changed, or rather, there were new ways to compete under the rules that our rules had never anticipated. I think something really vital to the capitalist system working well is that the capitalists and the workers actually need each other. And the way that you generate a lot of profit is by figuring out ways to use the workers that you have available to you productively, and in fact, to improve their productivity over time and to invest in them. And when you suddenly lift the constraint that you have to use the workers here and say, actually, you can go find cheaper workers with fewer rules governing them somewhere else, you really change the character of the game. And there are some things that are very good about that. We get a lot of cheaper stuff as a result. But we shouldn't be surprised that markets aren't actually generating the other benefits beyond cheaper stuff that we also expect of them. And so if you say, actually, we want to impose constraints that certainly at the margin push people trying to generate profit to use domestic workers, that's going to have costs. But the fact that it has costs doesn't mean it's a bad idea. If we define efficiency as the end goal, then yes, letting markets do whatever they want with minimal constraint will look like the best policy. But I think that's a question-begging approach. I think if we define what we want as an economy that actually generates opportunities for workers, then efficiency is only one among many values. And we have to rethink the rules that we're going to impose on markets so that they do generate the kinds of economic outcomes we're looking for. And I will pause there.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I think that's a very helpful framework to put on the table for our discussion. So now I'm going to turn it over to Oren for our second presentation.
Thanks for having me, and really pleasure to have this conversation. So, we're engaging with two key questions here. What impacts do market have on wages and working conditions? And also, how can governments better support workers in their communities? So before we can answer these questions, I think we first need a framework to understand how the market for jobs, the labor market, really works. For example, take a situation where the labor market in general is hyper competitive, with employers competing fiercely to recruit workers, retain workers. Well, then a different set of prescriptions and policies may be needed than if the labor market were one where employers have a lot more power and market competition is insufficient to guarantee or generate a living wage and decent working conditions. So, these days, talk about labor shortage is all the rage, and I'll have more to say about that. But what's really telling is just how rare such a phenomenon is here in America. The idea that restaurants are raising wages and still having a hard time keeping staff around sounds like a world, turned upside down, topsy-turvy, and that's because it is. And because even in times with pretty low unemployment rates in the past 40 years, employers have not felt that much pressure to actively compete to recruit and retain workers, especially for low and middle wage jobs. And so you might wonder, why is that? Why is the labor market not that competitive? And why is there such imbalance in market power? At a basic level, it's because employers have considerable power to set wages. And so they're not just simply set by impersonal market forces. Let's use an example. Target and Walmart have different wage policies. Okay, so Target's corporate minimum wage is $15 an hour. Walmart's is $12 an hour. In a world where competition led wages to be based solely on worker productivity, a cashier at Walmart and Target would earn the same wage, because otherwise competitors would snatch up underpaid workers. But in the real world, Walmart's low wages don't lead to a massive exodus from the company. Yeah, market forces matter, but they're also limited. And that's why employers have wage setting or monopsony power. So that's the word of the day, monopsony. So you may ask then, well, why do employers have such power? So there's sort of three key reasons I would argue the labor market has a lot of monopsony power. One, and the most obviously, there just may not be that many employers around for the type of work you're qualified to do. In these cases, the market's going to be concentrated among a small number of employers. But this is sort of the least common source of monopsony power in my mind, because even in thick urban labor markets, searching for and switching jobs can be costly. As sometimes people say, looking for a job is a full-time job. You need to find out about the jobs you want to even take, send out applications or do interviews, and then there's no guarantee that at the end of that process, you'll actually get that job. So these are what economists typically call search frictions. So it's sort of like in the physical world, frictions like rocky surface prevents water from flowing unimpeded, making puddles, right? In the economy, frictions in moving between jobs prevent workers from finding better paying companies who are interested in recruiting them. So we have concentration, we have search frictions. The final reasons opportunities may be limited and competition may be limited is because sometimes different people value the same job differently. Take one example, commute time. So you live 15 minutes away from the office. I live an hour away. You're going to like the same job more than I will. And it's not just commute time. Maybe it's the fact that I get along with my supervisor better than you do, or that I don't care as much about having to fill out some paperwork while you find it really, really boring. Whatever sources these may be, right? There are many different sources. When jobs are valued differently, a lower paying company can still keep some or many of its workers around for a while because the workers that stay happen to like some other aspect of the job. So we have concentration, search frictions, job differentiation. These are what I call the trifecta of monopsony or labor market power. In a world where monopsony power is prevalent and there is a lot of evidence, everything from experimental evidence with randomized controlled trials to more observational evidence, including or more quasi-experimental evidence, suggesting there's considerable monopsony power in the American labor market. In such a world, we need, I would argue, other institutional forces to countervail such power. These include policies, societal norms, and institutions. So markets matter, but so do minimum wage policies, Fight for 15 social movement, or labor unions. These other forces shape the terrain on which the market competition actually happens. So I think this is a really important development that since the 1980s, early 1980s, many of these countervailing institutions have in part or fully broken down. Take minimum wage. It's greatly eroded in real or inflation adjusted terms at the federal level. Take another one, private sector union membership. It's around 5% today. And norms about what might be an acceptable wage level, I would argue, has eroded, at least until fairly recently. Interestingly, the companies that emerged and spread during the 1980s, 1990s, for example, Walmart, often practiced lower wage model, displacing higher paying jobs. And so I would argue that this set of changes since the early 1980s have played an important role in explaining why, after adjusting for inflation, pay levels for lower and middle wage jobs have stagnated for nearly 4 decades, even as we have become a much more prosperous society overall. So, this all sounds pretty bleak. It may sound pretty bleak that the free market left to its own devices sometimes fails to deliver good jobs and high job quality for many American workers, and that supporting institutions have broken down. But here I would like to really argue that not everything is doom and gloom. There is a lot we can do to improve job quality. And interestingly, some of it we have already started doing. So let me talk about some solutions. First, I would argue that a tight labor market is a potent antidote to employer-side monopsony power. We're actually seeing this right now. We're currently engaging at the federal level in really strong spending to prop up the economy as it recovers. We didn't do this in the prior recessions in the past few decades. We're keeping interest rates low, allowing for the economy to recover faster. Running the economy hot, as the saying goes, and shooting for a very low unemployment rate can help correct partly the power imbalance between workers and businesses. Now, we also provided generous unemployment benefits during the pandemic. These were controversial, but I think they played a vital role in propping up consumption and spending, even while a lot of people were out of work. this also allowed workers to be actually more selective about what jobs they took, putting pressure on employers to raise wages, and raise wages they did. And because of that, I think a lot of research has found that the unemployment benefits did not lead to sizable impact on jobs, according to most academic research on the topic. Now, of course, the pandemic unemployment insurance have now ended everywhere, and now we've reverted back to normal UI, which unfortunately is quite minimal and inadequate, especially in many states, because there are no national standards. So for this reason, I think reforming UI, for instance, can actually be really useful, both for providing relief, but also by allowing workers to be more selective and finding better matches and finding higher wage jobs. But we can't count on a tight labor market or unemployment benefits to solve all the problems. This is why we need other tools. And I would argue that one really important tool is the minimum wage. Now, as Ben said, this is a topic I've done research for a while, maybe not quite many decades, but close to it. So interestingly, from a theoretical perspective, when the labor market has a lot of monopsony power, a judiciously chosen minimum wage can actually improve the functioning of the labor market. So it actually, in a highly competitive market, there may be a strong trade-off, like higher wage, lower jobs. That doesn't happen necessarily when there's employers of market power. In fact, weak competition can cause too many workers to be stuck at low productivity businesses, and a higher minimum wage, just like increased competition, can help reallocate workers to more productive entities. So in a monopsonistic world, a minimum wage does not have to lead to fewer jobs, because higher minimum wage can reduce vacancies, help recruit more workers, and not just kill jobs. So there's a lot of empirical evidence on what minimum wages do, and there are sometimes differing evidence on this question. But I would argue that the weight of high quality evidence suggests that in the United States, minimum wages so far have been quite effective in raising wages with fairly modest costs in terms of job loss. The federal minimum wage, of course, has been stuck at $7.25 for about a dozen years now. But for over 30 states have implemented state minimum wages, and 10 states have plans to phase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And this is actually a very popular policy. Over 60% of voters in Florida, for example, voted to raise their minimum to $15 an hour by 2026. So, it's hard to say what are options in the federal level, but I think even absent federal action, I expect more states to take bolder approach like in Florida. Wage standards also respond to public pressure. Here's an example. 10 years ago, there were no major companies that had adopted voluntary corporate minimum wage standards. This was just unheard of. But then came Fight for 15, and that pushed companies including Amazon, Walmart, Target, and especially happening in the context of a tightening labor market, many, if not most major retailers, as well as other large businesses, have implemented and announced voluntary wage standards. Now, you may think this is just cheap talk, people just saying, well, take the lowest wage you're paying and call it a voluntary minimum wage. But that's actually not what's happened. High quality research shows that these voluntary minimum wages were highly binding and raised wages at companies themselves, and also led competitors in local labor markets to match those raises, spurring greater competition. So this has been a really important development in my mind for again, helping rebuild wage standards. Ultimately, I think to really rebuild wage standards in America, we also need stronger labor movement. And that includes policy levers that make it easier to organize workers. And I think that's an important thing to strive for. But here, I think there's also a serious flaw in the US labor relations regime, which focuses on bargaining at the individual company or worksite level. This is very different from many other industrialized countries, like especially in continental Europe, where negotiations occur at the sectoral level. And then these contracts are extended to most companies. Doesn't matter if they're workers or members of unions or not. So I think sectoral standards can help reduce incentive of employers to fight union organizing drives tooth and nail as they do today. because they would need to abide by the collective bargaining agreement regardless of the union status of their workforce. So of course that would require major changes in the National Labor Relations Act, and that would at the federal level. But even in the meantime, there are things that states can do to build sectoral standards using wage boards. Simply put, instead of a single minimum wage, let's say in a state like Ohio, you could have different minimums by sector and job types, like take healthcare. You could have a minimum for registered nurses, another for nursing aides, another for home healthcare providers, etc. This is actually not so far-fetched. This is in fact, it's exactly what's in place in Australia, how minimum wages are set there. And closer to home, at least five states have wage board laws already on the books, though they're not very often used in practice. So let me just sort of wrap up here. I think, just to sort of conclude, I think the power imbalance in the labor market means there is a major role for government and supportive institutions to play, both to improve job quality and to actually make the market work better. So in the past 40 years, we've seen some of these institutions erode, but I think there's a lot we can do to raise job quality. And the good news is we're starting to do some of that already. So I'll stop here.
Terrific. Thank you, Aaron. I think what I hear from both of these presentations is maybe not a major disagreement in terms of the conceptual or analytic framework. So Oren, you referred to the market as a neutral processing mechanism. And Aaron, I hear what you say, you're saying something a little bit different, which is that employer power creates maybe from the get-go a less level playing field that makes the market perhaps less neutral. But given the constraints, Oren, that you talked about rules imposing and the different public policy levers that both of you talked about, I'm not sure if the major disagreement, at least so far that we've heard, is philosophical. And so I wonder, just to start the conversation, if I might ask you both to reflect on or respond to some of the policy proposals that the other had put forward. So Oren, if you wanted to maybe go first and respond to some of Aaron's thoughts on the virtues of the expanded unemployment insurance during the pandemic, the importance of raising the minimum wage, in particular, perhaps also the value of a strong labor movement. I think that'd be a great way to start. And then Aaron, I'll come back to you with a question about some of Oren's views.
Yeah, sure. I agree with a lot of what Aaron said, and particularly the point about power in the market. I would sort of classify that as one of those conditions where and in a sense, exactly what I mean when I say the market is just a neutral processing mechanism. How much power the parties have in the market is going to be an important determinant of outcomes. And I think Aaron is right that in recent decades, employers have, I don't know that employers have lost power or gained power, but workers have certainly lost power, and that imbalance is a serious problem. I agree very much with what he said about a stronger labor movement and sectoral bargaining in particular. I have a paper about that coming out on Monday. And I think he's exactly right about that direction. With respect to minimum wage, I agree also that raising minimum wages can be an effective and high benefit, low cost policy. I always just caution to be wary of the federal fight, because as Aaron acknowledged, there have been significant increases at the state and local level, and we have very diverse labor markets nationwide. It's actually, I think it's from a paper of Aaron's that I first learned to think about the minimum wage in terms of how it is set relative to the median wage in a labor market. And in general, the rule of thumb that economists on the left even have tended to use is you should want to keep your minimum at maybe half your median. And so that inspired me to go out and do a just very short paper a few years ago, just saying, let's take into account what the actual sort of effective minimum wage the typical American is living under in this country, given their labor markets, median wage, and the effective minimum wage governed by state or local policy, or federal if there is none. And I found it was almost exactly half the median. I think came about 0.47, essentially indistinguishable from Canada or the Netherlands or the UK. So I support high income markets raising minimum wages. I think that a federal $15 an hour minimum wage would be a very big mistake, given that we have parts of the country where that's not even the median wage yet. And I guess that brings me to my last point, which is, with respect to raising wages at the very bottom, I think everything that Aaron described potentially makes sense. I think it's really important not to let the discussion, that should be a focus of the discussion, but it shouldn't be the focus. That, when you're talking about people earning at or near minimum wage, you're really almost talking about anti-poverty policy. You're talking about folks whose income is going to be in the 20, 30K range. And where you then also have to keep in mind, we have things like the earned income tax credit. I'm a big supporter of wage subsidies that could boost those earnings significantly. But when you talk about, as I think we all started our comments, the sort of broad-based stagnation in wages for even middle income, even above median income households, in a sense, I worry a lot, maybe even most, about the household that is earning 40 to 50K a year, as they have been since the 70s, essentially. And the high school grad, but less than college, who we typically think of as the heart of the working and used to be the heart of the middle class. And that's where I think the sorts of policies that Aaron's been describing in terms of UI, minimum wage, I think it's very hard to get those to have much effect in the middle of the distribution. And so that's what draws me to these more sort of structural questions of how are we asking our market to operate, what sort of investments, what sort of businesses are being built, and how do we get the productivity growth and wage growth in the middle of the distribution.
Great. So Aaron, obviously I welcome you to respond to any of Oren's comments just now, but the other thing I'd want to put on the table is that Oren ended his original comments talking about globalization, and I know in some of his other work he's argued for reshoring supply chains. So I was wondering if you could add to your policy reflections. None of the things that you recommended specifically addressed the global economy in that way. So I wondered if you could also address that and how you think that what policies might help address the role of the American worker in the global economy.
Yeah, so when we think about sources of wage stagnation in America since, let's say, roughly 1980 or so, it sort of falls in several big buckets. One bucket is possible technological change and demand for skills. Another are institutions like deunionization and minimum wage. And then the third bucket is globalization and trade. And I think a lot of economists tended to de-emphasize the role of trade policies on having very substantial effect on local labor markets. In the sort of the 90s is when we started to look at these questions seriously, empirically. And I think maybe part of the argument maybe it didn't have as much of an impact until maybe in early 2000s. But whatever it may be, I think there's a lot greater appreciation that, especially starting with integration of China into the global economy, there were significant pressures and on the labor market, especially for those without a college degree, like Oren was saying, from trade policies. And I'm not sure if the answer to that is necessarily to say that trade is bad, but I do think that it means we need to, at the minimum, think about the costs of increasing trade integration more seriously, because I think at this point there's very strong evidence in my mind that these I think sort of the China shock, as it's called, had very significant employment and wage impacts that were highly negative for particular areas in the country, that led to broader social challenges as well, for everything from wages, but also to personal health and et cetera. So, and social malaise, if you will. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm not sure if I think in retrospect, I think we should have had a greater appreciation for retaining a manufacturing base than we did. I think there are additional gains that come in terms of rebuilding job quality. Can we do that very successfully? There may be ways to do things on the margin. I think there's some especially as we think about some of the infrastructure related transitions to more green economy, what have you. I think there's more room for sort of thinking about reshoring some things in the production. We're also seeing how sometimes, depending on the network, global network, we can actually be really sensitive to certain shocks, like for instance a semiconductor shortage, et cetera. And so I think that I do think that thinking more, taking the offshoring costs more seriously is an important thing to keep in mind. I just want to one other thing, going back to Oren's original the remarks. I do agree that a lot of people a lot of people put value to work, and beyond simply thinking of it as a cost in like lack of leisure. So I think that's empirically true for a lot of people. I do worry that if that leads someone, and again, present company excluded, sometimes it's used then to essentially require work as a condition for other things that I'm not sure should require those type of work standards. For instance, work requirements, for instance, for getting this right now, there's argument, should the child tax credit, which I think is actually could be a very successful anti-poverty policy, it already has been in many ways, should that be conditional on work? Well, there I think it should not be, but I think having a set of policies that allow people to work effectively is absolutely good. I sort of see unemployment benefits as one of those. A judiciously chosen but generous UI benefits can have even if it has some delay in how fast people end up re-entering the labor market, it can help them land at a better place. And so this is where I see a value for providing support even outside of the workplace. So I think there are trade-offs along those lines, but I think that while I agree that a lot of people do place meaning, value in terms of dignity for work at work, I think that one has to sort of balance that against sort of preventing that from leading to particular very specific policy prescriptions that may or may not make sense.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A that sort of pivot on these last questions. So I want to turn to those. I'll just read them for the benefit of folks. Dr. Linda Troutman asks, Oren discusses the reality of globalization and a labor market that reflects the inclusion of American workers across groups. What are your perspectives about the most optimal way of realizing this goal in this country? And then Joey Miller sort of offers a specific policy question about this. Says, given that both of you have voiced concerns about jobs going abroad, are you in favor of a government-funded program to invest in low-skilled manufacturing jobs in the US that produce green technology, which I think also pivots on something Aaron said. So Oren, if perhaps you want to ask first about your views about how to best realize the goal of aligning the status of American workers in a more healthy way with globalization. And then Aaron, if you have further thoughts, we can turn to that.
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think the globalization debate more than anything comes down to an issue of balance. That most of the sort of Econ 101 Blackboard theory of trade assumes that you trade one set of stuff for another set of stuff. And in that context, yes, there are still winners and losers created, but generally speaking, you are creating new demand for work as quickly as you might be losing demand for some other work. The problem that we have in the international system today is that we are not trading our stuff for other people's stuff. So if you think about the relationship with China in particular, we import about $600 billion of goods from China and send back 100 billion. Well, why is China agreeing to that deal? It's not out of the goodness of their heart, it's because they take back our assets instead. And so instead of trading goods for goods, they send us stuff that we no longer have demand to be made here, but they don't create new demand for our stuff. They either buy our corporate equities, corporate debt, treasury debt. Essentially, we're just sending back pieces of paper that say IOU, that at some point in the future, they have a greater claim on our prosperity. And that's both a short-term problem in the loss of demand for a lot of relatively high productivity labor that people in this country could be doing. And I think it's a long-term challenge for the trajectory of our economy. And so the remedy in my mind is to do things that make sure that there is demand for things produced in America. And partly we can do that by making it relatively more attractive to produce things here. I mean, our regulatory environment makes it horribly unattractive to build anything here. That's a real problem. Our education system is extremely good at cranking out dance majors relative to the rest of the world, and extremely bad at cranking out electrical engineers relative to the rest of the world. And so we have a real talent mismatch in a lot of cases that our education system, both higher ed and just even K through 12 and other post-secondary pathways could do a much better job with. So one piece is just getting better at making stuff here in ways that we've really handicapped ourselves. Piece two is doing that reshoring piece and trying to have supply chains here. And for that, I support a model that's called local content requirements, which is that you simply say the stuff has to be made here. You take important categories, let's say airplanes or 5G equipment, and you say 80% of the content in that product has to be domestically manufactured. And so you leave that opening that says, look, some things that's going to be better to get from elsewhere. But relatively speaking, whatever we're best able to make here, you suddenly create massive demand for. And I think investment will follow. And then the last piece is that you discourage people from buying our assets. You make it, and there are a few different ways to do this, either with monetary policy. You can just directly impose a tax on foreign purchase of assets. But you basically say to the rest of the world, we are not especially interested in you buying our assets instead of stuff that we make, and we are going to make it relatively more expensive to try to do that. And so I think all of those things I just listed will make stuff in America relatively more expensive to buy. And so if you are analyzing only on the dimension of how much cheap stuff can we have, then those policies look very unattractive. But if you're looking at the long-term trajectory of the economy and the kinds of opportunities in our labor market, I think the benefits greatly outweigh the costs.
Aaron, any further thoughts on globalization and some of the policies that were just proposed?
Yeah, I think maybe what I would like to emphasize is that, I said before that I think globalization has played a more important role than I think economists used to think in terms of the labor market. At the same time, I do want to highlight that, there are things we can do, experiment more with in terms of reshoring. And I think it's worth thinking about and, having smarter policies to do that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's going to be a huge part of a strategy of broadly raising job quality in America. it can be a component, but I think most jobs we have today are in the service sector. They're oftentimes even more tied locally to local labor markets. And I think we can improve those job qualities through a variety of channels, that we talked about, that actually don't require us to, broadly change our, our sort of trade policy orientation. I think in some ways, the most immediate thing and that we're actually doing that I think is making a big difference is our willingness to actually strive for full employment. And I really cannot highlight this enough, because I think we didn't do this in the 90s and 2000s nearly enough, both fiscal and monetary policy. So I just wanted to reiterate that I think that this is an important dimension of allowing a rebalancing of the bargaining power is by running the economy hot. And that just is something that, is about, does not require very, new and untested policies on the trade front, even though I'm broadly supportive of experimenting with some of those.
Ben, can I make one other quick point about that? I totally agree with Aaron about the running the economy hot. I think that's extremely important. And I particularly try to underscore to my fellow right of center folks that the success of the Trump economy empirically had nothing to do with the tax cuts and everything to do with running massive deficits and keeping interest rates low at the top of a business cycle. And so I think that's something really important, especially for conservatives to recognize. That being said, my concern with, while I support that approach, I think it's important to emphasize the limit of it, which is that I would describe it as having a level effect rather than a trajectory effect. That is, if we're concerned that, whatever the size of the pie is, employers are getting too much and we want to shift the power so that workers get more of it, a tight labor market helps do that. But it's not a repeatable process. You can't keep doing that and expect worker power to keep producing ever more wage gains in the absence of actual productivity gains. And so one of the reasons I really emphasize the reshoring type issues, it isn't because that's where most of the jobs are actually going to be. Aaron's absolutely right. We're overwhelmingly a services economy, but because that sector of the economy, I think, is uniquely capable of driving productivity growth and essentially producing a multiplier effect that allows everybody else to earn more money as well. So, somebody doesn't really cut hair any faster than they did 300 years ago, by and large. But a barber can be paid much more than he used to be because he is cutting the hair of other people who are much more productive. And when you sort of follow it down, there are plenty of service industries where you get productivity gains as well, but especially when you're thinking about local economies, if you have entire regions of the country that don't have a real actual sort of tradable goods sector that's able to grow and drive its productivity up over time, I think we can get the one-time shift of more power for workers, but we can't actually get that growth over time. And so I think that's a really important kind of dimension of the problem to think about.
If I could just respond briefly to that, there are things I agree with what Oren just said, but I do want to point out two things. One, if you have a tighter labor market, I think it's just likely that when there are any productivity increases for whatever reason, a larger share of that gets passed through to wages. So I do think there's a ongoing kind of impact and not just a one-time impact. But the other really important thing, I think, is that if you have a tight labor market leading to labor shortage, that also induces both adoption of particular innovations, think like robots or more kiosks at their restaurants. Then we may worry, isn't that going to displace jobs? But if that's happening because there aren't enough people around because you're running a really tight labor market, those productivity improvements are going to happen in the service sector, like increasing use of robots, increasing use of other types of software. So I do think there's actually definitely room for productivity increases, which then additionally allow for higher wages if you have sufficiently tight labor market. Some of this is hard to say because we haven't done it enough to have really confident answers. So I don't want to overstate the case, but I do want to point out that possibility, which is, I think, a pretty exciting possibility. And also that gets away from the notion that robots are taking our jobs, more to, can we please have some robots to take the jobs no one wants?
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask a kind of closing question that maybe pivots a bit from policy to punditry. But today is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of Occupy Wall Street. And I think in a lot of ways, we're still living in a kind of post-2008 financial crisis, both economic world and political world. I think a lot of people see that financial crisis giving rise both to Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. The Tea Party, obviously, one of the political currents that leads us to the Trump administration. And now under the Biden administration, I wonder, sort of, if we were to have this panel 10 years from now, what do you think the prospects would be for us to be in a world where, the economy actually, the market does in fact serve American workers better than it does now? What do you think the political prospects of actually implementing some of the policies you recommend are? Are we going to get to a world where these markets are doing better for workers rather than, to use the Occupy language, the 1%?
Let me answer that by making a particular observation, and I'm curious what Oren thinks about this. I think a really unfortunate fact is that a lot of really popular policies for rebuilding wage standard have become like unnecessarily partisan. And what I mean by that is there's actually a lot of support for sort of common sense policies to increase wages that actually could garner support from a lot of people across the political divide. A really interesting example is UK. So I worked with the Conservative Party government in UK on helping them develop a minimum wage, what they call a living wage policy. Very popular. I think there's room for something like that in the United States, but it hasn't happened, where the Conservative party in the United States, the Republican Party, has not really made that pivot at all. I am hopeful that, if you ask the possibility in the next 10 years, that could the GOP have a similar turn on some economic issues, especially on the labor market issue, as the Tories did in UK. I think it's possible, because after all, the Tories also pivoted. They weren't always in support, for instance, of a minimum wage. I'm also hopeful that if we can have the macro policies in place, we can actually change some of the way the markets actually works. And so I guess I'm somewhat optimistic that both on the market and the policy end, we may end up saying 10 years from now, things are in a better place. But that's me being hopeful.
No, I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but I'm also fairly optimistic on this front. I think there is a shift underway on the right of center that you see. You're not going to see it in the leaders who have been there for the last 30 years thumping the Reagan playbook. But if you look at sort of the next generation of folks in the Senate, for instance. Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, they've all been introducing proposals. Tom Cotton did a federal minimum wage increase with Mitt Romney. Now, it was tied to immigration policy, which is a whole other topic we haven't discussed. But said yes, the worker power is important and the minimum wage should be higher. Rubio and Hawley were very involved in a lot of the COVID relief policies and direct cash to families and paycheck protection. And so I do think that that signals the start. Rubio endorsed the union organizing campaign in Alabama. So I do think there's the start of something there. And likewise, I think, certainly within the Democratic Party, there are folks who are focused very heavily on the issue. And so I think there's definitely a story to be told where we will have partisan fights like we always have, but the baseline that people are working from is more focused on these concerns than it was when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were negotiating things in the mid-90s. So, that's the optimistic case. I think the flip side is you can certainly also see a world where, the Republican Party goes kind of in a more sort of explicitly Trumpist direction, and the Democratic Party sort of becomes extremely focused on social progressivism, and we just sort of head down a rabbit hole of culture war that doesn't really serve workers very, very well at all. So I don't know which of those is going to happen, but I think there's at least a positive, there's certainly a prospect for positive progress.
Well, it's nice to end a conversation on an up note, I'll say that. I thank you both very much for participating. I'm sorry we have to bring this to a close. I feel like we have a lot more we could talk about. We didn't really talk about immigration, as Oren said. We barely touched on education or finance, but hopefully we can. I know some of these conversations will continue throughout the year as the COMPAS program continues. Eric, I don't know if you have any closing advertising to do or anything else, or if we should just let people go.
No, just thank both of our panelists for a really constructive and interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This was great.